Okay, so today I'm going to talk with you about Bhagat Singh Thind and get into more detail, I think some more interesting and complicated detail about his life. But since UKPHA is a book club, I wanted to point out that the material that I'm going to be sharing with you today is based on 3 pieces of writing. In 2018, I published a piece titled Bhagat Singh Thind in Jail for Tides, which is the magazine of SADA, the South Asian American Digital Archive. In many ways, I kind of think of SADA and UKPHA as kind of like cousins across the Atlantic. SADA is dedicated to preserving and providing open access to South Asian American history, and Tides is their magazine to help tell stories of South Asian Americans. This talk is also based on a chapter titled United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind that I wrote for the edited volume, 25 Events That Shaped Asian American History, an Encyclopedia of the American Mosaic. And lastly, I'll be presenting material that will be, hopefully in the near future, also be coming out on Tides, tentatively titled Bhagat Singh Thind, Divorcee. So who is Bhagat Singh Thind? I think most people who are aware of his name associate him with a Supreme Court case in 1923. In many ways, people know Bhagat Singh Thind as the name from the court case, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind. So Thind arrives, like so many Punjabi migrants to the United States, in the early 20th century. He arrives in 1913. We know that he worked in the lumber mills in the Pacific Northwest. It seems that he had attended some university, and he was also connected to the gutter movement. He enlists in the United States Army during the First World War, and he's stationed at Camp Lewis. He doesn't see battle, but he is honorably discharged at the end of the war. And then he sets about to become an American citizen. It's worth making clear a few aspects of how one becomes an American citizen during this time. Citizenship is open to, and this is a quote, free white persons during this time. And America's sense of race is very much a racial binary. So for people of Asian descent, there's a lot of confusion about, one second. There's a lot of confusion as to how they fit into this racial setup. There are numerous court cases leading up to Bhagat Singh Thind's case about whether or not people from South Asia can be considered white or not. There's a whole interesting history of court cases where judges at various levels, city, county, and state, try to figure out how to determine the race of South Asians. So in some cases, they are compared to Jews, they're compared to people from the Middle East, they're compared to Armenians. In my favorite court case, as a point of reference, people tried to compare South Asians to hypothetical space aliens from the planet Mars. Thind has a long and difficult journey to try to become an American citizen. He applies and receives citizenship in 1918 in Washington State, and then that citizenship is revoked. In 1919, after he appeals the decision, he receives his citizenship again from the state of Oregon, and then that's denied. And so on his 3rd attempt to become a citizen, his case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The man on the left his last name is Ozawa. So if Thind is synonymous with his Supreme Court case in historical memory, he is also synonymous with Ozawa. Ozawa goes in front of the American Supreme Court to obtain citizenship in late 1922. And again, since citizenship is open to free white persons, Ozawa needs to make the case that he should be considered white. And so many of these cases are referred to as racial eligibility cases. And according to the way that his case is remembered, Ozawa claims that he is white based on phenotype. He points to his skin. He says, I have light skin. I should be considered white. And he further tries to justify his claims to citizenship by saying that he is an ideal candidate to become an American. He's a good person. He's assimilated. His children don't speak Japanese. They only speak English at home. And the court denies his claim. And they deny that claim based on the anthropology and racial science of the time. They say, according to this anthropology and racial science, you are Asian, and so therefore you are not white. Thind's case is only a short while later in front of the Supreme Court. And many people see Thind and his legal team learning from the failure of Ozawa to obtain citizenship. So Thind presents an argument that according to the same racial science and anthropology that the court seems disposed to believe, he, coming from North India, should be considered Aryan and Caucasian. The court unanimously denies that logic. In a unanimous verdict written up by Justice George Sutherland that you see on the left, Thind is denied. And the reasoning given by the court is that whiteness is determined by, quote, common understanding by unscientific men. So it doesn't matter what you look like in the case of Ozawa. It doesn't matter what scientists and anthropologists believe in the case of Thind. What really determines whether or not you're white is literally if the uninformed man on the street sees you and doesn't think that you're white, you're not white. This case has several important ramifications. Thind is not only denied his citizenship, but he and other people of Asian descent in the United States are ruled ineligible to be citizens. They are not able to become citizens. And so this has a series of cascading effects. There are already laws on the books in the United States that say that people who are ineligible for citizenship cannot own property, cannot own farmland. So this not only affects Thind and his chances to become a citizen, it affects so many other people. And the United States government goes one step further, and in the immediate aftermath of the Thind decision, there is a swift effort to revoke the citizenship of several dozen South Asians in the United States who had already become American citizens. And since to become a citizen, you have to renounce your previous citizenship, this left them, in the words of the media at the time, as men without a country. They had no citizenship. They belonged to no country. They couldn't leave the country. They had no government to support them. This is an important decision also because for many historians, this is one of the final big acts by the United States government just before another piece of legislation in 1924 that effectively closes the door to immigration, especially from Asia. There's a 40-year period from the mid-20s to the mid-60s that are referred to as the Exclusion Era, where there are very few, if any, Asian immigrants during this time. Immigration is severely limited and restricted, and it makes the case even more significant in hindsight. For a case that is so significant, we really know very little about the decision beyond what is written. It's a very short decision that doesn't say much. We don't know the insight that went into the writing of this verdict. In his own writings, Sutherland says very little about the Thind decision. So it's ironic, but it's also very appropriate in telling that such a significant decision for South Asians in the United States doesn't seem to have been that much of a consideration for the justice who authorized it. Most opinions are simply that it was an act of racism. Sutherland did not want people like Thind or the other justices as American citizens, and so they manipulated their own racial logic to exclude him. There have been a few scholars who have tried to give a deeper interpretation of the Thind verdict. This is Victor Jew, and in an article for the Centennial Review, he had a really fascinating piece where he looks at an earlier speech given by Sutherland before he was a Supreme Court justice. Sutherland wrote in defense, he was a senator at the time from Utah, and he wrote a speech in defense of his fellow senator from Utah, Reed Smoot. And what Jew notices is that Sutherland is in his impassioned defense of Mormons in the United States. And what he feels is the need for America to include them into society. Sutherland has reasons and exceptions for them that he doesn't extend to Ozawa or to Thind. He says that with the Mormons, that time facilitates assimilation. In time, Mormons will become part of the American fabric. He also looks at Mormon military service. And he says in the wake of the Spanish-American War, he has this poetic vision of God looking down on a group of dead soldiers. And Sutherland rhetorically asks, does God really make a distinction between the Mormon and the Catholic and the Protestant? But there's one telling difference. In his description of these dead soldiers, Sutherland describes, quote, their shining white faces looking up heavenward. So Victor Jew would argue that from this bit of insight that we have, maybe it is about race. Maybe the openness that Sutherland would have to including Mormons stops for people like Ozawa and Thind who also had military service because of race. A more recent look at Thind comes from Doug Colson in his book that was released a few years ago. He has a chapter on Bhagat Singh Thind, and Colson's argument is that perhaps one of the things that skews Sutherland's judgment of Thind is his involvement in gutter. I talked a few minutes ago about how Thind has multiple attempts at becoming a citizen. And in one of those earlier attempts in the state of Oregon, I believe, the judge notes that Thind was involved with the Gutter Party. But he then kind of in his writing is reassured that Thind was involved with Gutter and attempts to overthrow British colonial rule in India, but he is still in accord with the values of American democracy. Colson argues that during this time, in between 1918 and 1923, between Thind's first attempts to become a citizen and his ultimate rejection by the Supreme Court, there is a dramatic shift in America's views regarding race, regarding immigration, and regarding political extremism from around the world. Colson argued that the Hindu-German conspiracy trial that happens, the Red Scare, the panic throughout the United States of socialists and anarchists, and the open embrace of white supremacy by American thinkers and authors in the late 19-teens and early 1920s would mean that Thind's involvement with Gutter would be a much stronger liability when his case came in front of the Supreme Court. And that might have been one of the reasons why Sutherland rejected his appeals for citizenship. I argued something else, and I think it's worth noting that all of these ideas can exist simultaneously within Sutherland's verdict. I argued that perhaps one of the things that was also going on in Sutherland's verdict is Thind's turban. Sutherland's verdict, his opinion, pays a lot of attention to the visual, what people look like, the man on the street, his unscientific opinion, what he sees. And I think this makes sense when we go back in time and we have an understanding of how ethnicity worked and was viewed in the United States. when immigrants were arriving to the United States, overwhelmingly they were coming from Europe. They were arriving on the East Coast and through Ellis Island. And people had strong ethnic identities. Over several generations in the United States, these different ethnic identities kind of soften and they all kind of blur together into a more homogenized white identity. But when first generation migrants arrive, they have a very kind of thick and strong ethnic identity through language, through dress, through religion, through diet. And Sutherland mentions this in his opinion. He says, quote, "The children of English, French, German, Italian, Scandinavian, and other European parentage quickly merge into the mass of our population and lose the distinctive hallmarks of their European origin." And then he contrasts this with Thind and Hindus. And it's worth noting at this time that Hindu was not a religious term in the United States, but it was a kind of a geographical and racial term to mark all people from South Asia. He says, "It is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from the various groups of persons in this country commonly recognized as white. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the children born in this country of Hindu parents would retain indefinitely the clear evidence of their ancestry." So since about 90% of the immigrants from South Asia during this time to the United States are Punjabi Sikhs, when he is talking about Hindus, he is talking about turbaned Punjabi Sikhs. And this was common to the rhetoric that was out there at the time about Punjabi Sikhs in the United States. Writers and observers were fascinated, obsessed with the turban. One famous piece, "The Tide of Turbans," referred to it as the emblem of the people, the eternal symbol. And so my reading of Sutherland's verdict is that he sees the turban as being a barrier for Thind merging into mainstream white America. And in this view, in many ways, Thind's argument that he is an ideal candidate for citizenship, in a way it works against him. Thind, by saying that he is educated, by saying that he speaks English fluently, by saying that he has military service, this might mean that Sutherland would say, even with all those things, you still retain this mark that sets you apart from other white Americans. So in some ways, his argument may have backfired against him. What happens to Bhagat Singh Thind after the decision? As we know from previous talk that I gave for UKPHA and some other writings, Thind cannot become a citizen. He is denaturalized, and he has limited options open to him. So he does what several dozen of his fellow South Asian Americans do. He hits the road and he becomes a traveling metaphysical lecturer. He embarks on this career for about 40 years. So like many of his peers and colleagues, like Rishi Singh Grewal and Bhagwan Singh Gyani and others, it really makes up the bulk of his life's work. Thind is doing this more than he is doing anything else. And he seems to make a living out of it. And as I mentioned previously, not only was he not alone in this, but this relatively small group of traveling metaphysical lecturers, they are a significant part of the South Asian American community during this time. This is Theodore Fieldbrave in the early 1930s, who gives a kind of informal census of South Asians in America. And he lists Hindu swamis and yogis with farmers, students, skilled workers, and traders as being worthy of note. And these people, these lecturers and teachers, in short, what they do is they pick up on the American fascination with spiritual and mystic India that's fed to them through organizations like the Theosophical Society, through popular media like Stage Magic and pulp magazines. and they travel from city to city. And in each city, they offer free public lectures and then smaller paid private classes, and in many cases, one-on-one dyadic relationships, dyadic services, like life coaching or therapy or healing or psychic readings. And this is what Thind does, travels around the country for 40 years and makes a living in this way. So I'd like to bring up two aspects of Thind's life from this period that I think add a lot of depth and nuance to who he was. The first that I've written about, it occurs in Omaha, Nebraska in 1942. As Thind is moving from city to city, setting up shop, lecturing, and holding classes, he is staying at the Rome Hotel in Omaha. And you see in this picture, this is the Rome Hotel about 5 or 10 years after the events in 1942 happened. Thind, as he did several times in the city, he stayed at the hotel and he began to offer a series of free lectures that would lead into classes. And he is quickly arrested and then thrown in jail on charges of being a spiritualist. He is warned to stop his lectures, and if he doesn't, he has his day in court, and then he's thrown into jail for a period of 3 months, for a sentence of 3 months. And these are newspaper accounts of his imprisonment during that time. He is not only thrown in jail, he's treated terribly, and the local newspaper and the local authorities seem to delight in his humiliation and his imprisonment. He doesn't have a turban, so the newspapers kind of take delight in the fact that he has to cover his head with a towel. His usual diet is denied, and so he is offered bologna sandwiches and mush and coffee. And it really is a humiliating ordeal for Thind. And it's just an aside, if you do go to SADA's website, there is a recent article written by Savannah Kumar called "A Hunger for Fresh Food, A Taste of Chutney, and Freedom, Food, Injustice, and Incarcerated South Asian Americans," where she begins with the example of Thind in jail, and then has a remarkable piece about how food works for incarcerated South Asian Americans in the United States. So why does Thind end up in prison? In many ways, it's because he has absolutely terrible timing and bad luck. A few years previous to Thind's arrival in Omaha, there's a man named Muhammad Ashraf. We don't have much information about him, but he claims to be a Hindu mystic. And when he comes to Omaha, he comes in the company of 2 younger women, and he's arrested and he is put into jail on charges under the Mann Act, or the interstate transportation of women for illicit purposes. So it's unclear whether he has a relationship with these women or if he is trafficking these women. But it is a large and kind of notorious case in the city that casts a shadow over other people who would do things similarly. Less than a week before Thind begins his lectures, something else happens. A group of spiritualists get arrested in Omaha, led by a woman named Lulu Tabor. As some of you might know, spiritualists who claim to be able to communicate with the dead and are very often fraudulent, they do brisk business during times of war and sickness. It only makes sense that if your business is to communicate with dead people in times of death, business is very good for you. So Lulu Tabor and company set up shop in Omaha, and they claim to be able to get people into contact with dead relatives. And during the Second World War, there are so many people who have sons and husbands and brothers who have died overseas. And they put a kind of particularly devious devious and ingenious spin on things. They claim that if they can't contact the souls of these relatives, since they can only contact the dead through their methods, that must mean that they are alive. So they are not only exploiting people who are grieving, they are also exploiting people who are distraught over not knowing the fate of their loved ones. And so the Omaha police and district attorney come down with a swift vengeance on Lulu Tabor and company. They're seen as not only criminal, but particularly cruel and exploitive, and in a time of war, as also deeply unpatriotic and un-American. So this is what Thind walks into. This is why Thind is so quickly arrested and thrown in jail. He comes at this time and with all of the perceptions that Americans have of bearded, turbaned mystics from the East who claim to contact the dead, he is an easy target for local prosecutors. So what does Thind do when he's in jail? He reaches out for help from his comrade in the Gutter Party, Bhagwan Singh Gyani. Gyani was one of the people involved, one of the heads of Gutter in the 19-teens. Gyani was sent to prison for 2.5 years for his involvement with Gutter Party in the wake of the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. Thind knew Gyani, and Thind visited Gyani when he was in prison. And so when he was thrown in the county jail in Omaha, he wrote to Gyani for help. By the time he contacts Gyani, and through letter and through the phone, the local officials in Omaha realize that they've made a huge blunder. People start writing into local newspapers who know Thind, both locally and from out of state, and they are horrified that he would be thrown in prison. They talk about Thind as being a sincere and gentle and kind man, and they wonder what is going on that they would accuse him of fraud and so mercilessly throw him in prison. The local officials seem to have realized their error, and so they offer Thind a way out. They say, if you just register with us as a spiritualist minister, then we will we'll let you go. The whole pretense they had for arresting Thind was that he was an unregistered, unlicensed minister who was conducting services. And Thind, to his credit, is so deeply moral that he refuses to do so, even though it would let him out of jail. He says that he is not a spiritualist, and so he will not register as such. And in talking with Gyani, Gyani offers him a solution that is acceptable to him. He says, why don't you just register as a Sikh minister? Thind was already kind of given credentials by the Gurdwara in Stockton as a Pacharak and as a Gyani. And so this is a solution that Thind could be at peace with. So he does that, he gets out of jail, and the thing that I love, he doesn't leave Omaha. He puts an ad in the paper and he carries through with what he started. He holds a series of lectures, even though he makes very little money off of it, just to prove a point. And then he never returns to Omaha again. And this photo that was just sitting on the SADA website suddenly has this deep history to it. I never knew what to make of it. I knew that it was Bhagwan Singh Gyani and Bhagat Singh Thind, and was taken in the fall of 1942 in Denver, where Gyani was living. But the photograph has a much deeper significance now, when you realize that this is the embrace of two old friends, of two friends who were there for each other in their respective darkest and most desperate moments. The situation in Omaha, I think, is not only a great and fascinating story, but it points to the unusual position that Thind was in, along with the other South Asian American metaphysical lecturers, that they were really in the middle of a lot. Racially, they were not quite white, to use the phrase. The prosecutor that threw Thind in prison in Omaha, called him a rug peddler, and insinuated that he's Arabic or should be thought of as Arabic or not white. Thind is thrown in jail like a second-class citizen. He's denied many of his rights. He's really kind of railroaded in, and yet he also counted among his friends some of the most prominent people in Omaha. Several decades earlier, when he was in Omaha, Thind had his portrait painted by J. Lori Wallace, one of the most famous artists in Nebraska. And Wallace is really one of the people who establishes the fine arts in Omaha. And his portrait of Thind, taken in the mid-1920s, becomes one of Wallace's signature portraits that he shows around the world, around the country, that it's recognized by the Smithsonian. And Wallace is one of the people who offers to put up bail for Thind to keep him out of prison. There are also several ironies involved. One is that Thind is accused of being a spiritualist, which he is not, but many of his students in the city themselves were spiritualists. So it is not entirely false. Also, which I find fascinating, is that during his time in court, Thind is convinced that he is not being put in jail by local authorities, but that it's some British plot to undermine him. And his rantings against the British in court are held up as evidence that Thind is probably a little bit imbalanced and crazy, but he's crazy like a fox. We now know through evidence at the British Library that the British Intelligence Service was following Thind and several other lecturers as he made his way around the United States, including in Omaha. They would take notes on his lectures, they would keep tabs on him, and they would report back on what he was saying about British rule in India and what kind of efforts he was making on behalf of a free India. The other aspect of Thind's career as a lecturer that I'd like to talk about is his almost completely ignored early marriage to this woman, Inez Pierre Bullen, who's on the left. About 9 months after the Supreme Court decision, after Thind loses his chance for citizenship, he ends up in Spokane, Washington. This seems to be the beginning of the new chapter in his life. This is the first recorded time that we have of Thind presenting himself as a spiritual teacher and a metaphysical lecturer. And after only a few weeks in Spokane, on a cold and moonless night, he goes on top of a hilltop with several dozen people, and he marries Inez. And this is a photograph of them just after the marriage ceremony. This doesn't seem to be the first marriage for either Inez or Bhagat Singh. Inez was previously married in Wisconsin. She had a son from that marriage. She worked in Spokane as a copy editor for an advertising agency. And it appears from early records that Thind might have been married in India at a young age. In several documents preceding this marriage, Thind claims that he is married to a woman named Chindkaur from the village of Badwal in Amritsar. When it comes time for him to get married to Inez, he lists himself as a widower, which I believe you can see on the screen in front of you. Although I did attempt some digging, I wasn't able to find conclusive information on this. So it's not sure if Thind did get married in India and left a wife behind when he came to the United States. He certainly wouldn't have been the first Punjabi migrant to the US to do so, or if he listed a wife when he first came to the United States to make it easier for him to enter into the country. It's not clear. He marries Inez in this ceremony that seems very unusual and very chaste. The bride and groom don't talk about love or romance or infatuation. They talk in a very metaphysical way about their thoughts vibrating on the same plane. Inez looks up to Bhagat Singh Thind as a spiritual teacher, and she sees herself as a kind of helpmeet who is there to encourage him in his great metaphysical work. This time in Spokane, Washington, in late 1923, is the beginning of Thind's career as a metaphysical lecturer. Thind portrayed himself and was portrayed by people who wrote of his life after his death as being a kind of universal philosopher who spoke of truth, who synthesized truths from great world religions, and was, above all, explicitly a Sikh teacher who talked about his phrase, Sikh saviors, in most cities that he went. And Thind absolutely was a Sikh in that regards. He represented the Sikh faith, he wrote about the Sikh tradition, he lectured on the 10 Gurus, and he quoted from the Sri Guru Granth Sahib. But his time in Spokane also provides really clear evidence that he is not just pulling from those things. At the beginning of his career as a metaphysical lecturer, he is, like so many of his peers, taking from the metaphysical traditions around him, particularly the positive thinking school of New Thought and other forms of the American metaphysical tradition. We see this in the language that he uses. When he uses phrases like master of destiny, in tune with the infinite, this is textbook New Thought. So it seems that this is what he's pulling from to launch himself as a metaphysical lecturer. This period of time, late November of 1923, also seems to be the birth of the Doctor and Dr. Bhagat Singh Thind. There seems to be a lot of confusion and assumptions about Thind's holding of a doctorate. In fact, the commissioned biography for him was titled Dr. G. And it's often assumed that he became a PhD through UC Berkeley, even though there's a lot of confusion whether it was a PhD in literature or political science or history or theology. Thind himself claimed during his lifetime that he received his PhD in India, in Lahore, at the age of 19, which is ambitious and also very unlikely. The official website for him claims that he received a doctorate of divinity, which was his PhD, and those two things are distinct and different, but that he also received it from a metaphysical organization that didn't really come into being until long after he claimed to be a doctor. What it seems like is that Bhagat Singh Thind, like so many of his peers and colleagues, as he embarked on this new career as a metaphysical lecturer, he started to create his persona as he began. And this is something very common throughout many other people like him. Rishi Singh Garwal, Bhagwan Singh Gyani, Mohan Singh, Yogi Wasan, other people that I've talked about in a previous UKPHA talk. They put their persona together as they began, and this seems to be what Bhagat Singh Thind does. So just after their marriage, Inez tells a reporter that she's looking forward to helping Bhagat Singh Thind in his spiritual endeavors, that they will, quote, go where the call leads us. And apparently that call leads them to Montana and then in Utah. For the first several months of their marriage, they have something that kind of approaches parody. Bhagat Singh Thind gets top billing, first in Butte, Montana, then Anaconda, and then in Salt Lake City, Utah. He gives lectures, he is the main draw, but Inez helps him. She leads classes on healing and breathing and positive thinking in the mornings and in the afternoons. And in Salt Lake City, she begins to give lectures on her own. And here we have an example of that from the first few months. But then after not too long, they separate and their marriage hits a very rocky patch. In Colorado, Bhagat Singh Thind claims that Inez has come under the undue influence of the man you see on the right, Ralph Moriarty DeBitt, who is known by his spiritual name as Vidvan. DeBitt was a follower of a man named A.K. Mazumdar, who you see on the left. Mazumdar was another metaphysical lecturer. He was also, we believe, the first South Asian to be granted American citizenship. Thind, in a series of public claims, says that Inez was having some sort of an affair with DeBitt, and that DeBitt was using his spiritual power and position to exert undue influence on her. And things become very acrimonious. And I think one of the things that's so important about Thind's early marriage to Inez is the insight that we get from their marriage and their separation. When Thind goes to Omaha in 1926, Inez quickly joins him, and she is in another hotel a few blocks away giving a rival series of lectures. And an enterprising reporter realizes that they are a squabbling couple, and so he interviews them separately and then brings it together for a very gossipy, scandal-filled article. And from their arguments, one of the things that comes out is Thind's own sense of his racial identity. Many people see Thind's claims in front of the Supreme Court of being white as a matter of expediency, that he's claiming this so that he can get citizenship, so that he can be included. To the extent that many people believe that it was just a strategy. What we find through his marriage and separation with Inez is that outside of the court case, after the court case had been decided, Thind very openly and clearly states and restates his belief that he is Aryan, Caucasian, and white. We have a later article from Omaha on the top and the left, and Thind is quoted as saying, "I am white, I am a Hindu of high caste, and I told her, Inez, so before we married. I was a naturalized American citizen once, but the United States Supreme Court revoked my citizenship on grounds that I was an Asiatic. It was not because my blood is not white." And this is before their marriage. Thind is quoted by a reporter as saying, "This is not an interracial marriage, as some people may think. I am a member of the Aryan or white race, although born a Hindu." So there is more squabbling between Thind and Inez, but eventually it reaches a conclusion. Their divorce is finalized, and even though Thind says during their separation that he would never marry again, he does so. He meets a woman named Vivian, and by all accounts, they have a wonderful and loving marriage until the end of Thind's life, and they have a very happy family together. Inez, for her part, moves to the Bay Area. She works as a nurse. She continues to study with DeBitt and is part of his metaphysical school. I interviewed a woman who remembers Inez from the early 1950s at DeBitt's retreat center. And she remembers Inez as a very quiet and understated, but remarkably bright and intelligent woman. And this kind of, I was very tickled when I heard that, because the reporters that met Inez throughout the 20s, they all had similar things to say about her, that she was incredibly bright and intelligent. So what do we do with these kind of two events? What do we do with them in light of how we think about and consider Bhagat Singh Thind? In many ways, Thind's life became more than just his life, not only after his death, but in recent decades. He became an icon for not only Sikhs in America, South Asian Americans, and Asian Americans. He became part of history, and that history was used and adapted and enhanced in several different ways. This is a tweet from 2018 from the Sikh Coalition that talked about Thind's Supreme Court case. And they claim that Thind was the earliest known Sikh soldier in the United States Army who overcame racist laws to finally become a citizen. Thind becomes a citizen in the mid-1930s. There's a special act that's passed that allows for people who honorably served during the First World War to become American citizens. So Thind doesn't necessarily overcome these racist laws, but a loophole is opened up for him and a small number of people like him to become citizens through their military service. Other people like Rishi Singh Garwal, who you see behind me, had their own unique efforts to finally become American citizens. But the legend of Thind kind of becomes very legendary. This is a recent comic book that talks about Thind going to pursue higher education at the University of California at Berkeley. Instead of being stationed at Camp Lewis in the Pacific Northwest, they put him in the trenches at World War I. He never saw battle. And they depict Sutherland as really kind of muscular and gruff. He kind of looks like Theodore Roosevelt themed pro wrestler as he's slamming the gavel down. One of the more recent treatments of Bhagat Singh Thind comes from the short movie All Quiet on the Home Front, which is a dramatic reimagining of Thind's appeals for citizenship. And this is with an actor portraying his lawyer, Thomas Mannix. And it's very melodramatic, and it imagines that Thind is loath to claim that he is white, but instead it's simply a matter of expediency. And it's awkward. It's awkward to see, to place the reality of Thind's life to the legend that has grown up around him. So many of the things that we take as true or solid about Thind's life are not so on closer inspection. Thomas Mannix, I found through digging, has a very colorful past as a lawyer. Not once, not twice, but 3 times he was involved in fistfights in court. He also was alleged to have supplied alcohol during Prohibition to a judge. He's disbarred towards the end of his life, and he's reinstated just before his death. We already talked about Thind's doctorate. That probably wasn't a doctorate. There's also the claim that Thind was the first turbaned Sikh soldier in the US Army. And that's not true either. And kind of amazingly, he's not even the only turbaned Sikh soldier at Camp Lewis. There is another man named Mohan Singh, who was studying at the University of Utah, who was also a Sikh with a turban and a beard. And we see this at the end of the article. He's described as wearing the small white turban of his caste, and his clean-cut, bronzed face with its full beard made him a mark for all observers. And there is some evidence, and I think it really needs to be brought out, really fascinating, intriguing evidence that there were Sikh soldiers in the American Civil War 50 years prior to the First World War. There's a photograph that I'm sure you can easily find online of a reunion of Union soldiers in London. And one of these soldiers appears to be a turbaned Sikh. So with all of these things that are kind of taken away from Thind's legacy, what do we have? And I think what we have is someone who is very human. And in many ways, historical subjects are very much like the test cases that are subjects for cases such as Thind's in front of the Supreme Court. They're held up as idealized and singular people, when in reality, they, like us, are complicated with strengths and weaknesses. Some of the details that come from Thind's separation from Inez are embarrassing, but they're also human. And if Thind wasn't a doctorate, if he embellished his credentials to launch in a career, well, it was a career that he was forced into. And it was also a career that he seems to be very well qualified for. And that's perhaps what we get from our historical digging. We lose singular idealized people, but in return, we get human people, the strengths and weaknesses, who have failures and some embarrassments in their past, but also, like Thind in prison, have incredibly remarkable moments. And that we have individuals who are not just individuals, but like his friendship with Bhagwan Singh and his marriage to Inez are also the sum of ties that they have with other people throughout their lives. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask you, Amandeep, if you can give me a quick second. I need to cough, and then we can go to the question and answer session.
You go do that and get yourself a drink of water. An extraordinary story. That's one of the great lives in history. It's just a phenomenal story. And actually, in preparation for this, I was trying to read up around his life so I could, probe and ask questions. And there are lots of what we've heard today, which I don't think has been published before, because I was hearing it for the very first time. So thanks very much for sharing that research with us. So pop yourself back on camera when you've had a chance to have a drink and a cough. And if anyone's got any questions, you can type them, as you are actually, type them into the Q&A box, which is very good, and that comes up, and then others can vote those up or down, or I'll vote them up. And the other thing you can do is, if you pop your hand up, I'll select some people to ask a question. So if you want to come on live, as it were, and ask your question, just pop your hand up on Zoom, and I'll come to them. So Philip, thanks very much for that wonderful,
welcome,
brilliant talk on a little known figure. Philip, and I know historians don't like this question, but I'm going to pose it to you anyway. What was he like? If he was in the room with you, what would he have been like? Was he like the kindly old uncle? Was he one of those scary, intense uncles? What was he? And I'm sure he changed over his years, but just give me a sense.
I think you always have to kind of wade your way through the evidence. What do you have and who's saying it? But, by the accounts that we have from his students and his colleagues and people who know him, he's a very smart, kind, and sincere person. I think it's telling that when he's brought into jail in Omaha, it doesn't take prodding for all of these people to come out of the woodwork. And once the news spreads, you have letters not just from Nebraska, people who were there. You have letters coming from California. You have letters coming from other parts of the country who are very quick in saying, he was very sweet, he helped me, he was very kind. I think in some ways this gets to the question I think we talked about in a previous talk about the early yoga teachers of authenticity and fraud. And I think a lot of people really want to, fall one way or another.
Right.
Is someone sincere or were they a fraud? Was it real or was it a con? I think the best way to think of it is this role of the spiritual teacher, of the metaphysical lecturer. In many ways, I think of it almost like a vessel that these various teachers were able to put their own strengths and their own histories and their own abilities. So someone like Yogi Wasan, who's, strapping farm boy from the Pind, who does a lot of kabaddi and a lot of folk wrestling. When he teaches, there's a lot of physical culture and breathing and diet and physical strength. And Thind, for someone like him, who's very well educated and very well read, he is able to put a lot of this rhetoric and philosophy and learning So, while Yogi Wasan, when he goes to a city, in his free lectures, I think he's like bending bars, he's doing feats of strength. Thind is just giving like one lecture after another. He'll give a talk on Buddhism and on Sikhism and on psychology and on world affairs. So I think that's, perhaps the best way to think of it. It's in many ways, like the school teachers that we have, who have their own personalities and their own ways of reaching their students. I think it's very similar with these lecturers.
So he's this kind of kindly, well-read, bookish, smart guy who's got options, unlike some of the kind of mill workers that perhaps had fewer options. So why does he join the US Army? Is that a love of country? Is that him kind of expressing his warrior saint persona, or is it a play as part of his Americanness?
I don't know. I mean, as far as we know, the biography of Thind that is out, Dr. G, it's a commissioned biography. It's commissioned by the family. So, the family has preserved a lot of artifacts, but also, this is kind of the nature of history like this. They're also controlling some of those archives. So who knows what else is out there? As far as I know, we don't have a clear record. We don't have, at least as I know, a letter with him opening up and saying, I joined the army because. We can speculate. We can speculate that it was just what you do. Maybe he had family members who joined the British Army in India. Maybe it seemed like a better option than working in the mills. Maybe it was seen as part of a plan to become an American citizen. It's hard to tell, but I think all of those are, possible options.
And so you touched on his family, his descendants, and Dejbal's question here is actually the most popular one that we've got, which is, did you find or interview any of Thind's descendants?
I'm going to handle that question carefully. I did not speak at length or interview any of his descendants. I know that his son David is the one who has made incredible efforts to republish his father's works. He has a website, and I know that he has scanned and uploaded some of those British intelligence documents and other things. But I think he is the only one with a kind of living connection to Bhagat Singh Thind. As you and I have spoken about many times privately, I think there's a whole world to discover in India of relatives from the other side of the ocean.
Now, sure. Remind me, where was his village? Because we've got people I know from Chandigarh. I think if Ishwar's here, Ishwar's from Amritsar. Remind, was it Gurdaspur? I can't remember the.
I know it was close to Amritsar, and I'm not sure.
The village was Barawal, wasn't it? The famous village from the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Was that right?
I know that's where Chindkar.
That was it. Yes, of course. That was the noted first wife, wasn't it? The apparent first wife was from Barawal. But so presumably he was from around that kind of area. People that generally didn't go far, but yeah, it would be good to. Unfortunately, the pandemic has kind of hindered our ability to be able to move around these places. So, all right, thank you, Dejbal. Thank you for. Oh no, actually, Dejbal's got a second question, which I'm going to let him have cheekily. Do you know what regiment he served in, by any chance? It's a military historian's question. They love this.
I don't, and anything military or World War I, I'm just going to throw up my hands and defer to you. Salute you and defer to you.
Dejbal's third question is: do you know the size of the badges on his? Yeah, forget it. They love those button questions, right? Right. Gosharan Kalsi's question more about the denial of citizenship. How much of a role would Orientalism have played in the decision to deny Thind citizenship?
I think it both plays a role and it doesn't play a role. So, Thind's argument to the Supreme Court. In many ways, it's an Orientalist argument. In some ways, he is claiming that he is high caste. He is, relying on the idea of an Aryan origins theory. He is making a clear distinction between northern India and southern India. In more detail, he says that his blood has been kept pure through caste. He actually makes the comparison that caste does what racial segregation does in the United States. In the same way that he says that, a white man would be, offended at the prospect of marrying and having children with a black woman, caste has done the same thing in India. So it's the more you think about it, it's a very awkward argument. And in many ways, he is relying on, in some ways, Orientalist assumptions to make that claim. I believe it is with Sakram Ganesh Pandit. This is one of my favorite cases of racial eligibility. The argument that was made was just pure Orientalist fantasy. It was, I think it was Pandit. I know that there's one case where someone told the judge, look, because I have crossed the dark ocean, I have been rendered an outcast from my Brahmin family. And I was a prince in India. I had a wealthy estate. I had elephants. I had gold. And I renounced all of this to come to the United States. And the judge buys it. He says, oh, you gave up your Brahmin caste privilege and you denied us to come to the US, stamped, approved. So, I mean, I think it's both, it can be Orientalist in several ways. It can be this kind of fear of the turban, imagining the turban as this emblem of a radically different other people, but also Thind is relying to some extent on Orientalist fantasies of India and South Asians.
That's really interesting. And now, as a result of that denial that that Krishan talked about there, the denial of his citizenship, it also led to other South Asians losing their citizenship as well. So was he a resented figure? Was he someone who had kind of screwed things up for other people? Or was it just, this was just the sort of swings and roundabouts that happened in this path?
I mean, I think he was seen universally as a good person who was unjustly denied citizenship. And in fact, there are echoes of that decision throughout the United States and throughout the world. I believe in India, there were, it was seen as a great insult and an offense that he would be denied citizenship. I know there was talk, I believe, I think in the Indian Congress, that there was a topic of discussion of how could they insult us like this.
And actually, you know what, Philip, I don't know if you're catching the chat. You don't have to, by the way, because there's like too much going on. But I did notice that Madhu Mita, who is Thind's brother's great-granddaughter, she writes here, mentions his village and mentions villages which is in Taragar. It says village Taragar, also called Talawan in Amritsar. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Please reach out to me. I would love to talk further.
Okay. Well, Madhu, if you don't mind doing that, I'll just drop us something in your chat, just to us, just to the panelists, with your email address, and I'll make sure I connect you in the background. Thank you very much for that. Friend of the book club and friend of mine for many years, Satwinder Sammy's asking a very practical question. How did he fund all this, Philip? He went to court multiple times, expensive business, and then he traveled around the United States. He seemed to have a life of maybe not wealth, but certainly amount the means to be able to do things that others wouldn't.
I'm not sure about the court litigation. I just don't know specifically. I imagine if he's working in the mill, if he's in the army, that he would have some funds available to him. I imagine that his case would jump out to an attorney as an opportunity to review a case in front of a high court. I think in many ways it was that question of, are Asians eligible for citizenship? I think that was kind of seen as a test case, a significant test case that would be in the air during that time. As far as his travels around the United States, I mean, that job of metaphysical lecturer was a very self-perpetuating kind of existence. It's difficult to do the books on that kind of career, although I have from bits and pieces. So those kind of paid private classes in dyadic services were never really advertised. But through a little digging, I think I found for about 5 or 6 different teachers, you could see what they charged in the years that they charged it. And so I think the best way that you could compare it is if you're doing a workshop, in 2021, it's going to be about several $100s for a weekend, or about several $100 or pounds for a series of evenings. So if you just imagine that, these small, even these small classes of 15 to 30 students, if they're all paying $100 or $200 each, and you're in a town for a few weeks doing that, you're able to pay your bills. And, I worked it out. They're basically making a decent white collar living, the same as, an accountant or an engineer or something like that. So it was a career, and it was a lifestyle that could fund itself easily.
Right. And of course, there were some that made fairly significant amounts of money doing that. I mean, when you last came to talk about the early yoga movement, or Punjabis in the early yoga movement, I'm going to completely mess up and get the wrong name, but is it Manmohan Singh?
Mohan Singh. Yogi Hari. I mean, the more I think about it, I think the best comparison for that would be if you ran your own restaurant versus owning franchises. So the 2 most successful yoga teachers during that time are Yogananda and Mohan Singh. And they both do something very similar. They employ managers and press agents. So they, it's not a surprise that they're filling up large auditoriums. They have advanced men, they have press agents, they're running advertisements. And they also both have affiliates. So Yogananda brings over friends from India that then kind of have territories in the United States. And they have students, and they sell books, and they send money back to the mothership. Mohan Singh does the same thing. Before he leaves the United States, he has a vision, and he appoints 13 teachers to continue to have classes and send in money. So I think it's really just a matter of scale, of how big you do it. But for someone who's an independent like Rishi Singh Garwal, Bhagwan Singh Gyani, Bhagat Singh Thind, you can make a comfortable living. His wife Vivian, they have a house in Hollywood. He's able to support his children. All of those things. It's a little bit opaque because Thind is one of these teachers who doesn't advertise rates, but also he worked on a donation basis. He said, I only accept donations. Here's the suggested donation amount. I was always a bit confused by this, but then he got in trouble with the law in Ohio. And it makes sense, because if you are charging for classes, you could be under health laws. Are you charging to give medical advice or services? So I think that is why, one of the reasons why he just took donations. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Interesting. Okay. Now, Vijay has a very interesting question, but let me just preface this with, I think I'm going to really like Bhagat Singh Thind. I think I'd quite like to be in his company. I'd like to learn from him. He seems like a stand-up kind of guy. His move not to be too expedient when he was extracted from what was a horrible incarceration in Omaha, just really speaks to his personal integrity. So Vijay's question is, How would you compare and contrast Thind to Harbhajan Singh Yogi?
Not a scoundrel. Did I just answer it in 3 words? Yeah.
Well, there's some comparison. There is some comparison there, though, isn't there? In as much as Harbhajan Singh Yogi started a kind of a, well, was teaching a sort of a new age religion, whatever you want to call it. And then that really snowballed, and he was phenomenally successful at that. Now he had deep personal vices, but there are some comparisons which are not favorable, but which are very similar, and then there are some things which are very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. You know, one of the mentions that was made in the, I think in the chat or in the comments was, I believe it was mentioning Thind's involvement with Santmat, that tradition, Kirpal Singh, Inner Light and Sound, and you know, we do have evidence, you know, right from the commission biography, that Thind was offering people initiation, and some of the titles that he was using and that were put on him in that biography, they are they're very I hear the dog barking now. They're very inflated, and I think it would be very awkward for a Sikh to take on such titles. Puran Avatar, Satguru. So I mean, I think, you know, he's a complicated figure, like so many of these figures are. In some ways, he is simply representing the Sikh faith. You know, Stockton Gurdwara gives him a literal card saying that he's a pacharak and he's a minister. He's facilitating, he's ministering funerals for Sikhs that die. You know, you have a very small scattered Sikh population in the 20s and 30s. There's a man in San Antonio who dies. Thind takes a train down to, you know, kind of do rites for him after his passing. He's representing Sikhi at larger events in 1933, in his books and in his lectures. But also there are those things too of, you know, when you're offering initiation, when you're literally and figuratively putting yourself out as a guru, it's awkward. I think Yogi Bhajan is so beyond the pale from what we know now about the extent of his fraud and his abuse and his criminality that it's, I mean, in some ways it's really difficult to put him in company with anyone other than people like Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein, to make it awkward.
It really is very. Yeah, in fact, much of that has come out after the talk that you did with us, actually. So there's a lot of data, a lot of information that's come out afterwards. Kulvinder Singh has asked a couple of questions, and Kulvinder, you seem to know the story quite well. So Philip, tell us a little bit more about how Thind tried to be different from Yogi Hariram, who we just spoke about, who was painted as a con man, taking advantage of the gullible public by reporters. So you've spoken a little bit about that, but is there anything more you want to?
I mean, I just think, you know, Thind has a different set of skills and a different personality. From everything that I can see about Yogi Hari Rama, he is in some ways, it's like he's like a mercenary. He has a 3.5-year tour of the United States, and he is there to make money and get out, from everything that I've seen. You know, the fact that I think an interesting difference is Yogi Hari Rama never returns to a city twice. And like some newspaper reporters kind of like pick up on it, like, oh yeah, you don't want to return to the scene of the crime. There's something different with people like Thind and Gyani and Gurwal. When they're returning to the same city once a year, twice a year, there's also some kind of community building there. They have groups of students. They have a familiarity. You know, it says a lot that when Thind goes back to Omaha, you know, J. Laurie Wallace, the painter, is there to support him almost 20 years after he paints his portrait. So there are kind of deep ties and deep relationships. And I think that's a difference of, you know, Thind, you know, put down roots. He had a family. He has a wife in Los Angeles that he's supporting. He has this kind of network, these kind of friends and students that he sees again and again. I think that's something that's a little deeper than just kind of pulling from a different skill set.
Gotcha. Thank you. Janab's got a couple of questions, both of which touch on race and discrimination. So parallels with the South African apartheid race laws, if that's a comparison that you've made. And also, how does the discrimination and racism that Thind faced compared to the hierarchy of hate faced by new and immigrant ethnic communities in the US? In a sense, he sort of rose up the hierarchy and came down again, but
rose up and came down. I mean, I think that's, you know, the history of South Asian Americans, the history of Punjabi Sikh Americans, it is valuable and it is interesting in its own right. I would also say that it is worth knowing also because you really see, you know, the hierarchy of hate, you really see the full spectrum of race and ethnicity and Orientalism through the lives of these traveling lecturers. You know, it blows my mind to think about how so many of these figures they're physically assaulted, they're harassed by the police, they're imprisoned. You know, Thind's experience is not unique to him. Other lecturers are run out of town, they're thrown in jail, they're threatened with arrest, they're harassed. One of them, I believe it was Devaram Sakul, was attacked by a taxi driver in San Francisco. So in one sense, you know, it's the lowest of lows, but these same people also count as their friends and colleagues, some of the most affluent, influential, and cultured people. You know, the fact that Thind is friends with, you know, lawyers in Omaha, with Lori Wallace, other teachers, they have movie stars, they have industrialists, they have incredibly wealthy people. It's the full spectrum. The fact that they were denied citizenship and embarked on these careers really shows how much they're in this kind of ambiguous limbo in the United States racial hierarchy. They're not white, but they're also not white. In many ways, they are, you know, a lot of them, there's a reason why they don't travel through the South, because when it comes to Jim Crow laws and being able to patronize hotels and restaurants, they're treated very much like African Americans. Mohan Singh was told in a hotel in Texas that he had to keep his turban and robe on at all times in the hotel so that the guests wouldn't be confused and they would know that this is a South Asian man who's here, not an African American man who's here. So it really is this full spectrum of kind of every spot on this hierarchy of hate. And also just like the weird, unique things of, you know, who else could claim to be torchbearers of ancient Vedic wisdom, or, you know, have pure Aryan blood, as Thind and others do.
Two final questions, Philip. One is, what's his legacy today, Philip? Is there anything left of, is there any vestiges of his kind of teachings or even his impact in the legal world? And what's his physical legacy? I mean, you mentioned a son, but are there more descendants?
You know, there's an official website for Bhagat Singh Thind, which I think you can find easily online.
Yes.
He has family in the United States and in India. So, you know, there is family that is still there. His son has done an incredible job of reprinting his works and making them available and still in existence. So, you know, if you want, it's very easy to read what Thind wrote, to study the lessons that he taught his students. You know, I think that his case in front of the Supreme Court, it really, you know, sadly, it's not just a historical footnote. You know, we would like to think, and you know, we're approaching in another, I think, year and a half, we're going to approach the centenary anniversary of that Supreme Court decision. Sadly, it's not a historical footnote. These questions of denaturalized citizens, of bans on immigration from people from large swaths of the world, that's happening in recent years, making the Thind case, horribly relevant. And also, I think it's kind of the most immediate reference point when you talk about hate crimes against Sikhs in the United States. Thind's time in front of the Supreme Court, his fight for citizenship, I think is, one of the most significant and most well-known examples of that kind of discrimination.
Thank you. And then final question for you. If people want to find out more about him, we know about the website, but I'm just curious, what else is around? What's around in the popular media at all? Is there any serious documentaries been done of him? But and then in the written world, what would you recommend?
If you go to my website, you can find a link to the piece for Tides about his time in jail. There are, on the Thind case and the background to it. I've written pieces on that world of traveling yoga teachers, so that can provide some more context about Thind. In addition to the official website, I will always recommend going to the South Asian American Digital Archive, and you can that Thind wrote, photographs, pamphlets, mentions of him. The treatment of Thind in popular media has been, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, it really is just it's just a snapshot of this Supreme Court case. And in many ways, it's important, and I'm glad that it still gets mentioned, but it's also very limited. You just have a brief run up to the case, and then after the case, in many ways, he just kind of vanishes. Maybe you hear, oh, and he got citizenship in the mid-1930s. A dozen years later, he gets it. But like so many of these figures, the full breadth and the complexity of his life often gets ignored. I mean, I think it only adds to him as a figure. It doesn't diminish how important and fascinating he was, or what kind of window into American life and the lives of Punjabi Sikhs that his life can show us. But I mean, that also brings up, I'm sure, as you know, it brings up what I think are like the two kind of competing definitions and understandings of the word historical that people have. You often hear people say, this is a historical moment, which usually means it's important and people will continue to talk about it. But then you have the craft of history. When we say that we are doing historical work and historical digging, that's a more complicated, a messier, but I think a more fruitful endeavor to look at people in their complexity, and to see not only their lives in kind of a full sense, but all the other people that come together to make those lives. And with Thind, you have, his family back in India. You have this early marriage to this remarkable woman, Inez. You have his lifelong you have all of his friends and colleagues and students that he makes as he travels throughout the US. And it only adds to a fuller and richer person that we can then appreciate and understand.
Philip, thank you very much. You just clipped out a little bit there, but I think that's the internet telling us that perhaps our time has come. Philip, that was absolutely...
Right at 10:30 too.
Absolutely fascinating. A remarkable, amazing life. I'd recommend all of you go to Philip's website. We'll put it in the email that comes out at the end of this. in any case, but if you just Google him, it's the first one that you hit. So Philip Deslippe, and it will take you down a rabbit hole, as it did when Philip and I first met. We were talking about Yogi Wasson, and from there I've read into the lives of lots of these remarkable people who were sort of pioneers in the early American yoga movement, not least of which Bhagat Singh Thind. So thank you very much indeed, Philip. Thank you very much for those of you that joined us today. I appreciate your time. Join us next week, another remarkable life, and that's the life of Frida Bidhi, as I mentioned earlier. But thank you very much indeed for your time. And Philip, have a good rest of the day. Thanks for joining us so early in the morning.
No problem. Thank you for having me again.
Take care.
Bye.